All right, guys, so please make sure you take out your reform movement worksheets, the two-column worksheet that you got in class today. Remember, there are two sides, so please make sure that you fill in this as we go along or afterwards. Again, you can rewind as much as you feel is necessary, but make sure you're filling it in as we go along. So let's get started. All right, hey guys, time for the second video lecture. Let's try it out again. I know some of you had difficulties with the first link that I tried, but I adjusted it, so we're going to use some other website to use. It's TeacherTube. It's kind of like a YouTube channel. But anyways, this topic is about the mid-19th century reform movement. Now, due to all that immigration that we talked about last time and the work you did the previous night, society felt like it was time to improve things. They felt like with all the new influx of different ideas and cultures and religions and just the personalities of these different immigrants, they needed to improve upon society. So they kind of the development of a couple of different reform movements. So there were just a few that we're going to talk about. There are a lot more, but we're only going to focus on a few of them. The first one we're going to take a look at is something called the temperance movement. We talked about all the factories built in the New England area, and a lot of these factory workers would take their paychecks and they would, on the way home, go to a saloon or a bar, and they would waste their entire paycheck and come home to their families with no paycheck. What are you supposed to do without any money? You need money to pay your rent. You need money to buy food and provide for your family. So a lot of the women and the church folk and clergy created this temperance movement in order to try and ban the sale of alcohol, the consumption of alcohol, because they felt like it was bad for society. They felt like society needed to improve, and the only way to do that was to get rid of alcohol. So they put forth laws in the different cities and towns and states to get rid of the sale and consumption of alcohol. So that's really our first prohibition, so to speak, because we do have a prohibition later on in the 1900s, but you guys will cover that in U.S. history too. Another movement we're going to look at is the conditions in these factories. Okay, so staying on that factory trend, these people worked in these deafening conditions, really terrible, dangerous conditions, to the point where it was like, imagine standing next to Niagara Falls and for all day, going deaf. The conditions were extremely dangerous. They're very crude machines, open parts, so it wasn't like it was covered by anything. So if you stuck your finger in the wrong spot on the machine, you'd lose a finger. And they just replace you with another worker. So what the people working there did was create labor unions, and these labor unions enabled workers to actually, talk to their bosses and try to improve working conditions and hours and get breaks and not be working in such dangerous conditions without fear of losing their job. Because if somebody individually walked up to their boss and said, "I don't like what I'm doing," they say, "You're fired. I'll replace you." So what they did was they created these groups of people, collective bargaining unions that enabled them to actually sit down and talk with their bosses, improve conditions so that the workers would be happier and do better. And eventually, the owners of these businesses found out that that was the only way to go. So in order to produce more things, make more money, you have to have happy workers. The next thing is, in order to improve society, in order to get better workers, you need to improve education. So one thing the society in the mid-19th century thought was extremely important was improving the education system. Prior to this, education was very basic. If you were rich, you got an education. If you're poor, you worked with your father. If you're a female, you stayed at home with mom and learned how to cook and clean and take care of the house. So they need to improve education. So in 1837, Massachusetts actually sets forth the first state board of education, creating a fundamental center for public education. Everybody could go to school, minus African Americans. Obviously, we know that African Americans were kept away from the educational realm of society. The first college to actually accept women, which was a step forward, was Oberlin College in 1849. And again, African Americans, enslaved or not enslaved, were not deemed intelligent enough to be educated. And if enslaved African Americans were caught trying to educate themselves, they were severely beaten. So they were not able to get any sort of education whatsoever. But eventually, 1823, we see the first African American actually gain a college degree, named Alexander Twilight. The next improvement we're going to talk about is the conditions for mentally ill and needy. This was an extremely important aspect of society because a lady by the name of Dorothea Dix um, was working in hospital, was working in, I apologize, in jails. And so the conditions that these women were facing in jails, and notice that these women were not criminals, they were just mentally ill. Society didn't know what to do with mentally ill people, so what did they do? They threw them in jails with regular criminals. So she saw this as something that needed improvement. So she would build these hospitals for the mentally ill in order to separate the criminals from the mentally ill, so that you could actually take care of it. Because again, prior to that, we didn't have the education or knowledge to understand that mentally ill was something that was different. Well, it wasn't different. It was just odd, so we just threw them in jail. So Dorothea Dix goes ahead and she's kind of noted with building 32 new hospitals dedicated to the mentally ill in order to help facilitate the needs of those people. We also have college for the deaf. Again, the deaf were seen as mentally ill. Something was wrong with them. They were thrown in jail. So what they did is Thomas H. Gallaudet forms this college for the deaf in 1817. It's still in use today. I believe it's right around Washington, D.C., or in the Georgetown area. It's still in use today, very popular, probably one of the most noted colleges for the deaf in society. And the last thing we're going to look at is talking about all these reforms. We have this desire to have a perfect society, and I know you've talked probably in English class or reading class about utopias, something that is, the perfect society. People felt that if you had a perfect society, reforms weren't necessary, there were no problems, we could just get along. Okay, so the one religious group that we connect with utopias are the Shakers. Okay, they were a religious group that were known. The reason they call it Shakers is because they were just known to shake with religious emotion. Okay, and they wanted to create a utopia. They realized it was not perfect; it could not work. So a lot of those utopian movements failed. So around the 1850s, we see kind of a shift in the reform movement, and it's more or less not to reform society in terms of the mentally ill or education, but it was to improve the rights of people in general, those natural rights that we talk about in the Constitution. Okay, life, liberty, pursuit of happiness. And we see people really focusing on rights for African Americans, rights for women, so abolition, suffrage. That's the next topic we're really going to take a look at in class. But for right now, make sure that you've filled in that worksheet that you were given in class today for the reform movements. Okay, answer the question. There is a question on the back. Please make sure you answer that in complete sentences. And I will collect that in class tomorrow, and you'll be doing an activity on the reform movement, focusing on one or more of those reforms. All right, guys, I'll see you tomorrow.